In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one man stood at the pinnacle of American finance, shaping the destiny of an entire nation. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, better known as J.P. Morgan. This is a story of the man who owned America. As Morgan himself once said, a man always has two reasons for doing anything: a good reason and the real reason. He owned the first billion-dollar company and controlled some of the country's most profitable industries. At times, the U.S. economy itself relied on Morgan's decisions. With a single word or signature, he could rescue a company from bankruptcy. While some people admired him and others criticized him, there has never been another person quite like J.P. Morgan. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837, in Hartford, Connecticut. From an early age, he was groomed for success in the world of finance. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a successful banker, and young Pierpont was educated at the finest institutions in Europe. J.P. Morgan's education was incredibly international. He studied in Switzerland and Germany before attending the University of Göttingen. This gave him a broad perspective and a network that would prove invaluable. However, despite his wealthy background, John's childhood was challenging. He was a sickly child, frequently suffering from severe coughing fits, migraines, seizures, and diseases like scarlet fever. These health issues prevented him from playing outside with other children. Instead, he spent his time indoors, studying and reading financial statements. At one point, John became so ill with rheumatic fever that his father sent him to live alone in the Azores, an island group in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, believing the climate and salty air would aid his recovery. John stayed on the island for nearly a year without his family. Once he recovered, he continued his education, studying in Boston, Switzerland, and Germany. By 1857, he was ready to enter the workforce. J.P. Morgan's father was a junior partner at a London-based merchant banking firm called George Peabody & Company. Thanks to his father's connections, John got a job on Wall Street at a banking firm that managed Peabody's American interests. Part of his job involved writing reports to his father's firm about the financial and political situation in America, which was still an emerging market at the time. Despite his father's belief that John was too rational and even-tempered to become a successful financier, John showed early signs of his daring nature. In 1859, while on a trip to New Orleans, John took a risky gamble by using company money to purchase an entire shipment of Brazilian coffee that had arrived without a buyer. Although he sold it at a profit, his father and the senior members of the banking house disapproved of such risk-taking. In 1861, at the age of 24, John decided to leave the security of the established firm and strike out on his own. He founded his own company, but continued to act as an agent for his father's interests. Around this time, John married Amelia Sturgis, but she soon developed a persistent cough that was diagnosed as tuberculosis. John took her on an extended honeymoon to the Mediterranean, hoping the climate would restore her health, as his father had tried for him years earlier. Unfortunately, Amelia died just 4 months after their wedding, leaving John a devastated widower at 24. He never fully recovered from this tragic loss and immersed himself in his work more than ever. During this period, the American Civil War broke out. In 1863, conscription laws meant John could have been drafted to fight, but he paid $300 to avoid enlisting, hiring a substitute instead. Despite not fighting, John profited greatly from the war. One notable example was when he financed the purchase of 5,000 surplus carbines from the government at $3.50 each. These rifles were considered too old to use, but a consortium, including John, made minor adjustments and sold them back to the government for $22 each, making a significant profit. This war profiteering was controversial and unpopular with the public, but it was just the beginning of the larger controversies and challenges J.P. Morgan would face throughout his career. In 1871, John Pierpont Morgan saw a golden opportunity to team up with one of the leading financiers in the country, a banker named Anthony Drexel. Together, they founded Drexel Morgan & Company, a private merchant banking house which was later renamed simply J.P. Morgan & Company. This firm would be the one John managed for the rest of his life, and it served as a precursor to the modern banking titan we know today as J.P. Morgan Chase. Early in his career, John excelled at connecting wealthy investors with visionary entrepreneurs, earning significant profits and building his own reputation. He soon identified his first major investment, the American railroad system. At that time, most other major industries were dominated by a single magnate, Carnegie in steel and Rockefeller in oil. But the railroad industry was fragmented, with many competing companies offering similar routes and often slashing prices to win customers. While most saw this fierce competition as a problem, John saw an opportunity. He believed the solution was consolidation, merging railroads to create larger, more efficient entities. John knew that bigger businesses could benefit from economies of scale. His goal was to turn multiple small companies into one unified conglomerate. Instead of competing against each other and driving prices down, these merged railroads would set whatever prices they wanted since they would own all the nearby lines. John invested heavily in multiple railroads, took over underperforming companies, streamlined their management, and merged them into dominant players to crush remaining competitors, which he then also acquired. This tactic became so effective that it was named Morganization after him. Unlike other businessmen and investors of his time, John played a very active role in the management of the companies he invested in. He wasn't content with simply buying shares and raking in the profits. He craved control and wanted to be the one calling the shots. He regularly used his influential positions on the boards of directors to direct companies as he saw fit. He often reshuffled leadership to his liking and assembled monopolies with himself at the helm. When the railroads came to him for help, he refused unless he was given full control. This not only gave John the power he desired, but also created a more stable industry, attracting even more investment. European money flowed into U.S. railroad companies, now seen as more stable thanks to John's efforts, making him even wealthier. John continually acquired more rail lines, always aiming to outdo his previous achievements. For example, he purchased 50,000 shares from William Vanderbilt's prominent New York Central Railroad. He then executed the largest transaction in railroad bonds ever made in the United States, underwriting the sale of $40 million in bonds to finance the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Before long, John owned one-third of all railroads in America, at a time when 60% of America's stock market capitalization consisted of railroad companies. In other words, John was no longer just a wealthy financier. He was literally shaping the nation's economy. His involvement in reorganizations and mergers grew his power and wealth, and his reputation as a formidable titan of industry was matched by his intimidating appearance. John had a skin condition called rosacea that inflamed and ruptured the blood vessels in his nose, making it very red and disfigured. He also had rhinophyma, which made his nose larger and covered in pimples. John was very self-conscious about his appearance and hated being photographed. According to his grandson, whenever John had a portrait done, he always asked the artist to retouch his nose to look more normal, which is why it's not as noticeable in pictures of him. His striking facial features, combined with his towering height and aggressive way of speaking, made John an intimidating presence. In 1901, John finally met a formidable opponent, President Theodore Roosevelt. John had consolidated his Northern Pacific Railroad with two other railways in the region, creating a massive new holding company called Northern Securities Corporation. He had been able to get away with such monopolistic practices due to his close relationship with President William McKinley. However, after McKinley was assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt became president and had a very different view of what John was doing. Roosevelt ordered the Justice Department to file a suit against the company for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Despite John's fight in court, the company was ultimately broken up. This marked the beginning of a very tense relationship between the two men. When John heard that Roosevelt was going to Africa one year, he remarked, "Good, I hope the first line that meets him does his duty." For John, though, this was merely a small setback. He was already planning something much grander and more ambitious. In 1901, Andrew Carnegie Steel Company was at its peak, dominating the industry and generating $40 million a year. Ready to retire, Carnegie wanted to sell his company, but who could afford it? Enter John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan asked Carnegie to name his price, which turned out to be $480 million, the largest business deal in history at the time. Morgan agreed immediately, even confessing later that he would have paid $100 million more. This landmark purchase in 1901 was just the start of Morgan's ambitious plan. He merged Carnegie Steel with Federal Steel Company and other businesses to form U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, with a market cap of $1.4 billion. To put that into perspective, all manufacturing in the country was valued at a combined $9 billion. This deal gave Morgan control over two-thirds of American steel production. He had conquered both the steel and railroad industries, two of the largest at the time. Morgan didn't stop there. He financed Thomas Edison's early electrical experiments and played a crucial role in merging Edison Electric with its competitors to create General Electric. He was also influential in creating what would later become AT&T. Morgan's skill in combining companies into unstoppable giants was unmatched. However, a crisis was looming. In 1893, the U.S. faced an economic depression unlike any before. Decades of unchecked growth and investments led to a market crash, causing stock prices to plummet, thousands of businesses to close, and hundreds of banks to go bankrupt. Unemployment soared, and foreign investors cashed in their American bonds, depleting the U.S. gold reserves. With the dollar tied to the gold standard, the American government needed to maintain a minimum of $100 million in gold reserves. By 1895, reserves had dwindled to $9 million, threatening a default on loans. Without a central bank, the situation was dire. President Cleveland realized that traditional bond sales wouldn't suffice. Morgan proposed a drastic plan. A private syndicate of prominent bankers, working with foreign investors, would buy $65 million in 30-year bonds with 3.5 million ounces of gold. An old Civil War statute allowed Cleveland to approve the deal without Congress. Morgan's actions immediately stabilized the financial markets and restored confidence in the economy. While he made a large profit from the deal, he had also single-handedly saved the nation from collapse. The event highlighted the immense influence of a single banker on the U.S. economy and raised questions about his motivations, whether they were patriotic or opportunistic. In the next election, the relationship between big banks and the government was a hot topic, but Morgan and his banker allies donated heavily to the Republican nominee, who won, maintaining Morgan's government ties. In 1907, another financial crisis struck, with banks on the verge of bankruptcy. People rushed to withdraw their money, causing chaos. By this time, President Roosevelt, who often clashed with Morgan, agreed that collaboration between the government and big business was necessary. Roosevelt called on Morgan to save the situation. Morgan gathered top financiers and bank lenders, devised a plan to invest in smaller competitors, and locked them in a room until they agreed. The U.S. Treasury also contributed $25 million. Despite suffering from a severe cold, Morgan's efforts injected capital back into the economy and restored public confidence, averting another disaster. Despite being hailed as a hero, people soon realized the country's dependence on one man. John was increasingly scrutinized as the era of unchecked power for robber barons waned. He was summoned to testify before the Pujo Committee, which investigated Wall Street's influence on the economy. The Pujo Committee's work led to the creation of the Federal Reserve, ensuring that the economy wouldn't rely on a few powerful individuals. John died on March 31, 1913, at 75, and his son took over the business, continuing its expansion. Today, J.P. Morgan Chase, formed from numerous mergers including Bank One, Bear Stearns, and Chase Bank, stands as the largest bank in the world by market capitalization. John Pierpont Morgan's legacy endures, marked by immense influence and lasting impact on the banking industry.